All right, well, welcome to this section. We're going to talk a little bit about imagination and how it operates when we engage with heaven. So, take it away.
Take it away. All right, so when we start saying the word imagination, it may cause a bit of a freak out, right? So we've kind of grown up with this notion that the imagination is like fantasy land, and it's something that you are solely responsible for. You know, like it's just coming from you. Like you're a human being, you have this capacity to imagine things, and that by nature, it's not spiritual. Like that would be the notion that most of us come into this with. Now, maybe that's not true for everybody, certainly not everybody watching.
But it's certainly a fantastic tool of the enemy that he has taught us that it's a toy, not a tool.
Exactly, and a toy that society tries to drive out of you. So like, it's tolerated when you're under 5, and it's tolerated when you're over 65. But anything in between, and it's getting in the way of you becoming like this productive taxpayer, be a cog in the wheel or whatever. Just you got to get in there and be normal. And the imagination would get in the way of you being normal. So you think of imagination, and it brings up like daydreamers.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. People that have their head in the clouds, and you think of those negative connotations that come with the word. It's really easy to see why it can be like a tripping point for people when you start saying, hey, if we're going to spend time in heaven, we have to start using the spiritual muscle, which Paul calls the eyes of your heart. But I think if he had written that today, he would probably have said your imagination. Yeah. So when he says it, he says, I pray that the eyes of your heart would be illuminated or enlightened, so that you can then see, and he goes on. And I think, in his vernacular, he didn't even have that word, imagination. So, words, of course, change meaning over time and culture, and sometimes we don't even have words to a certain point. Now, this is totally off subject, but I find it really interesting. Just to prove the point to whoever's watching, like I'm not making this stuff up, right? Do you know that the term lady, thinking of a woman as a lady, is just as old as like the 1100s or 1200s AD. Did you know that? That blows my mind, right? It was never, no one ever thought of a woman as a lady. And it came from this poem about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And it was the first time that someone referred to a woman as a lady. And it came from this German word. Ladies, don't freak out if you're watching this. It's not like it's not a great beginning here, but it came from this German word that meant the dough kneader, like someone who kneads the dough.
Okay.
I know. But in context, that's where we're going here. In context, the word meant something more than just a dough kneader. It meant a gentle, kind, person of the opposite gender who you should respect.
Yeah.
That notion of a woman being a lady is what gave birth to like chivalry in the Middle Ages.
Wow.
But it didn't exist. The word itself didn't exist. I find that fascinating. Now, imagination has a similar history. So where we think of that as a word that everyone would have always had and could have used, that's not true. That word comes across again, and think of it like in the last 1,000 years, but maybe even more like the last 500 or 600. It really doesn't appear in language until that recent. Before that, the word that everyone had was inspiration. Now that word broken down, inspirited, inspiration, a spirit coming inside you. Now the other term for that, again, no one freak out, these are just words. Possession. That's what inspiration really was. It was you being possessed by something. Now think of that in the positive sense. Think of the Old Testament when the Holy Spirit comes on Saul, and he's suddenly prophesying when he's not a prophet. He was possessed, but with something not demonic, obviously. He something came into him from the outside, entered into him, filled him up, and then all of a sudden he was capable of things that were unusual for him. He was capable of supernatural, beyond the natural kind of things. So for a long time in history, everyone thought that if mankind did something unusually awesome, it was a product of inspiration. Some spirit, we hope good. In the case of the Bible stories, I mean, 99% of them, I'm sure. There might be one example of something coming on someone. I'm thinking back to the Old Testament, but in the Old Testament, it's definitely good. It's the Holy Spirit coming on someone.
Yeah.
But anytime mankind did something like that, that was the notion. A spirit beyond them came into them, made them capable of radical new ideas, thought, behavior, action, whatever. So we might say that's the genius of man, being like the more than the normal kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, that goes on for a really long time. A big shift, of course, happens. Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost had fully come. Then the Holy Spirit comes on all the believers, enters in, and this is the radical change, doesn't leave.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit comes in and establishes there a part of mankind, which we might even take for granted today, that there came into man the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit never left. It almost like you could think of it as building a residence, or perhaps even building that part of us called our spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure how developed that was before that moment. Maybe that when it talks about in Joel, about the Holy Spirit being poured out on all flesh, and that happening, remember Peter references that? I'm not entirely sure that wasn't God giving humanity a totally new part of themselves.
Wow.
Can I prove that? No. It's total speculation. But something, again, to think about and have a conversation about.
There's a book written by Ian Johnson, and he shares in there, 2 Hebrew words. Now, I have a hard time seeing this, but I mean, this comes from his understanding, and he has a pretty good understanding of the Hebrew language. But nephesh,
Yeah.
that being the Hebrew word for what he says, the animalistic side of the soul.
Yeah.
And then help me out, what's it?
Neshama.
Neshama being the spiritual side of the soul, and that is what we are born again. That's what we get when we're born again. That
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
never heard that, but I like where that's going, for
Yeah.
sure. All right, so that happens, right? Holy Spirit comes in. Whatever happened to us metaphysically and all across mankind, we'll find out as we go.
Yes.
Right.
But something happened. It came in. The Holy Spirit came in and dwelt there. And then that was it. That never left. That never changed. So if we just kind of watched what happens with what we think of as inspiration as an idea starts to change too. Because everyone thought the genius of mankind was coming from outside of man. Once the Holy Spirit came in, and all of a sudden you had knowledge, wisdom, the ability to foresee,
Yeah.
all of a sudden the genius of man, the miraculous, the genius of man is coming from inside man. Not in some kind of, again, this is where I think we get tripped up. Sometimes it's so easy to think too much of ourselves,
Yeah.
but then at the same time it's so easy to not think enough of ourselves because of what God has done. So here now the genius of man is inside of us. So we have to start as a race, a species, right? Then we start to rethink the origin of the genius of man until this moment where this imagination word comes out. Now, that again doesn't happen until after this advent of the Holy Spirit has played out enough that we start to think there's something inside of us that's a part of us that's as inseparable from us as any other part. It can never go. That's what's responsible for it. And the origin is now in here and not out here. So if we were just charting the word imagination, it comes from, like if we charted its word tree, it comes from this root inspiration. That's the root of the word. Over time it changes because the origin changes to imagination. Then imagination splits over the last, hundreds of years, centuries, not millennia. Over the last centuries, imagination as a word splits. One split retains the original definition of the genius of man coming from inside man. The other imagination word tree goes off into what we would think of as flights of fancy. And that became the imagination
The
that...
devil's limb.
Right. Well, yeah. And certainly, even in a positive sense, that's the flights of fancy of childhood and the daydreaming that we all did in school because we were bored out of our minds. So that's that limb of the tree. Now, over time, probably because of things like the scientific revolution. Maybe one day we'll talk about that, but probably because of the massive changes the world went through after about 1600. That notion of the genius of man being imagination really fell away. And the only definition that stayed was the one that was the flights of fancy. And that's why we think of imagination today as just that, when in fact it's really this tree that goes all the way back to there's something inside of us now that is doing all of the incredible, beyond what we're capable of work.
Yeah.
Now, when we're going to heaven in the Spirit, and we say, use your imagination to do it, and we relate it to Paul's eyes of the heart, right? It's a spiritual muscle that we've been given. It's just a question of whether or not we're using it. And because of the semantics in the language, it helps us to find a word that goes with the eyes of your heart, or being in the Spirit. And we would just say, you're going to have to use the imagination, but as its true definition.
Yeah.
That should go a long way to helping us with that word, so that we're not so afraid of doing it. The other thing is when we start to do these heavenly journeys, when we're practicing being in the Spirit, and you're using that muscle, there's always going to be this temptation, not a temptation, a bit of a fear that I'm making this up, right? This is the classic thing.
Yeah.
Everyone
Yeah.
that's done this
Yeah.
has felt it. And if they say they haven't, they are lying through their teeth. They're every single person that has made an effort to experience life in the Spirit in the heavenly places has had the thought, I am just making this up. Now, my strategy when people say that is to say, you are. Like, let's just call it out. You are making it up. It just so happens that the part of you that's making it up, though, is the Holy Spirit, which is totally inseparable from you.
Yeah.
You would not know the difference. Like, you can't tell that it feels like it's just me. I know. That's how incredible the advent of the Holy Spirit is. You got a part of you
Divine
that
nature.
you didn't have before.
Yeah.
And it's inseparable from you. So it should feel like your heavenly experiences and encounters are coming from within you.
Yeah. And we're created to create.
Exactly.
So it's part of what we're doing with that spark of the divine nature
Yeah.
that's implanted in us.
And so when folks get tripped up by it, I just to be a little cheeky about it, I'm just like, well, if you're waiting for it to hit you from outside, and you're waiting for that to happen because you're afraid of making it up, you're actually going back to possession, to inspiration, which is possession, which is unnecessary because of the advent of the Holy Spirit.
That's good.
So you should get comfortable with letting your imagination do all of the work.
Yeah.
Which means that when you're picturing Jesus, there's a part of you that already knows what Jesus looks like.
Mm-hmm.
When you're imagining the garden and walking with the Father in the garden, there's a part of you that already knows. You just have to admit it.
Yeah.
But and people say, but Christopher, I'm just making Jesus say what I want him to say. Yeah, okay. But the part of you that's doing it is the part of you that has been infused and is inseparable with the Holy Spirit. So that's a way to, again, to help with the practicing
That's
of these
good.
things.
That's good. So let's we're going to take a break, and then we'll have each of you come on back, and we'll do some exercises together. How about that?
Sounds great.
All
See you
right.
soon.